Have you ever wanted to rid the earth of someone? What would lead to that kind of conclusion? Welcome to Theology Sabbath School, a ministry of the School of Theology on the campus of Walla Walla University. I'm Carl Kosar, the Dean of the School of Theology and the host of Theology Sabbath School. Today we're continuing in our study of the book of Acts entitled The Spirit and the Church, the Faith of the Earliest Christians. And we're kind of winding down towards the end of the book. The book ends in chapter 28. And today we're looking at chapter 21 and 22, two pivotal chapters that will set up the kind of last final stage in Acts of the book, Acts of the Apostles. And so to help us understand what's going on in these chapters, I've invited my friend and colleague, Dr. Paul Dibdahl, to join us. So Dr. Dibdahl, again, thank you for coming back to Theology Sabbath School. I'm just curious, perhaps as we get started, we'll just jump right in, and maybe you could give us the context, because the book's not over yet. The story's still taking place. What's the background? What's taking place in these chapters, 21 and 22, that's going to be the focus of our attention in this lesson?
Yeah, so in the book of Acts, we read about three missionary journeys that the Apostle Paul takes. And these chapters 21 and 22, record events right at the end of that third missionary journey. So it's in the mid-50s. The third missionary journey is like 53 to 57 AD, something like that. And Paul is returning by ship to Jerusalem. And when he arrives in Jerusalem, we'll talk about this, but when he arrives in Jerusalem, things do not go very well. And not surprisingly, actually, because as he is headed towards Jerusalem, there's a couple of occasions where people speak to him and warn him about the danger that awaits. But he goes to Jerusalem anyway. So that's kind of the setup here right at the tail end of the third missionary journey.
You know, it's an interesting issue in the book of Acts, because Paul seems to have this kind of goal in mind that he wants to go to Jerusalem, he wants to preach the gospel there, and he is opposed on the way there. He has this event in Acts 20, which was the focus of last week's lesson, where he has this meeting with the elders in Ephesus, and he says, I'm never going to see you again, I'm going to Jerusalem. And then as he begins to travel there in chapter 21, we get this interesting passage. It's in verse 4 that Paul comes to the city of Tyre, we're told. And it says, through the Spirit, they were telling Paul not to go on to Jerusalem. But Paul is determined. So how do you make decisions on, where is God leading if they're saying this through the Spirit, but then Paul feels convicted to go? And then it happens again when he gets to the city of Caesarea, where he has kind of a similar warning of what's going to happen. So I guess my question back to you would be, was Paul disobeying the Spirit? Should Paul have stopped and turned around, or was going to Jerusalem his God-given mission?
Yeah, so you read verse 4, and then you alluded to like a similar experience that happens, and it's in verse 10. This is a we passage, so I know this quarter we've noted that at various times in the book of Acts, the writer of Acts, Luke, is with Paul, and this is one of those spots. And verse 10 says, after we had been there a number of days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. Now, Agabus, we've already been introduced to him earlier in the book of Acts, and he has predicted an upcoming famine. This is a prophet. And coming over to us, he took Paul's belt, tied his own hands and feet with it, and said, the Holy Spirit says, in this way the Jews of Jerusalem will bind the owner of this belt and will hand him over to the Gentiles. So the Spirit is warning, is speaking to Paul through believers, the prophet, and through the other disciples, the other believers, about what's going to happen. So you asked me if this was a mistake on Paul's part. And I'm not sure how to answer it. I think that God can work sometimes, well, not can work sometimes, but can work through a variety of circumstances. So I think that his will could have been accomplished, for example, in the life of Paul, perhaps in a different way. But it's hard for me to look at these passages and say, no, clearly, um, Paul should have just continued on. I do wonder, and I'm worried that in saying this, I'm setting myself up for criticism. But I do wonder if there was maybe another way. Having said that, now I'm going to kind of try to cover my bases by noting that I think it would not have been lost on Paul that Jesus, who was not from Jerusalem, made his way to Jerusalem, knowing the trouble that would befall him there, knowing what would happen. Jesus informed others of what would happen in Jerusalem, and Jesus went anyway, right? Because there was something that would be accomplished through the suffering, Jesus' suffering, and even death that would take place in Jerusalem. So I think that's probably the subtext here with Paul, that like Jesus, he's going to Jerusalem knowing, well aware of what will befall him there, but he goes willingly. He goes willingly. And sure enough, as was the case with Jesus, even through his suffering that he endures there in Jerusalem, his arrest, his beating, um, God will also accomplish his will through Paul's suffering and trial in Jerusalem. So I don't know if does that sound okay? Do we need to cut the video and record again because I've said something wrong, or is that a perspective that's okay, Carl?
Well, I'll make it a little more complicated. So there's a passage in Acts 20 that um, is a difficult one, particularly when I talk to my students about this. It's one that we kind of struggle with, like you kind of said as well. In Acts chapter 20, when he's speaking to the elders in Ephesus, Paul says in verse 22, "And now, behold, I'm going to Jerusalem." Then here's the interesting part where he says, "constrained by the Spirit." Not knowing what will happen to me there. So it's interesting that he's constrained, meaning like he's compelled by the Spirit. But then on the way there in Tyre, they tell him not to go by the Spirit. So it is an interesting passage because it's like is Paul doing the right thing? And I think he is. He feels constrained by the Spirit, and maybe this. My students often say the solution to this is that each of us have to come to grips with how we feel God's Spirit is leading in our life. And I think there's truth to that. Like you said, I think you said it really well. Because when you look even at the words of Agabus, that prophet, Agabus never really tells him, don't go. There's not like a command from God that says, Paul, if you do this, you're no longer an apostle. He actually says, this is what's going to happen to the man who goes. And his friends are like, oh, don't go then. And Paul's like, suffering is the path that Jesus went. And so it is. I really like how you said it. I think Paul is following in the footsteps of Jesus on his way to Jerusalem. And just like Jesus, suffering appears to be part of that plan for what Paul is going to experience when he gets there to the city. So I don't know if that kind of adds a dimension. It is a challenging passage, don't you think?
Yeah, no, it does. And again, since this is just a conversation between the two of us, which is recorded, we can't in this moment open it up to a group of people. But I think this is a fascinating discussion question. Paul, compelled by the Spirit, the believers, it says that you read that passage, right? The believers warned. I'm looking for it. Verse 4, through the Spirit, they urge Paul. So you have this kind of conflict even. And you're right, nowhere is there a direct command not to go. So maybe that's kind of our way out of it. But it seems as though there's urging by the Spirit. So an interesting discussion question. I don't think we'll settle it here. But yeah, fascinating. I think it's fascinating.
So Paul does go on to Jerusalem, and his reception there is one that's a little surprising because it's not like, there's these open arms, we're glad you're here. There's actually some suspicion still after all these years. When we saw back in Acts chapter 9, when he first comes to Jerusalem, 3 years after his conversion, that they're kind of afraid to meet with him. And it's Barnabas who allows this connection. And now, after all these years of ministry, his conversion was probably the year, 34? So we're now about the year 58. So, a long time has gone by. And he's not welcomed entirely with open arms. Can you say a little bit about the situation there and how Paul attempts to show his loyalty, which there's some who question his loyalty?
So he arrives in Jerusalem, and people are happy to see him, and he tells what God has done in his ministry, and people, rejoice. They praise God. And then it's interesting, verse 20 of Acts chapter 21, it says, when they heard this, they praised God, right? All the good news. Then they said to Paul, and their speech is like, that's great, praise the Lord. But here's kind of the rumor that's been going around. And that is that you're telling the Jews to turn away from Moses, not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. They're going to hear that you're here. There's going to be some trouble. So they set up, they encourage Paul to participate in rites of purification with 4 other men, which involves sacrifice of a lamb and of 2 pigeons for each of them, and checking with the priests and so forth. Like they say, participate in these rituals, these Jewish rituals, and the thought is that this will kind of demonstrate to people that, no, you really are a Jew, right? You really do follow the customs of our people, and that will help to solve the problem. And Paul agrees, and he goes along with this. Now, it doesn't actually solve the problem, but the fact that he did this for some people is there's some debate about this. Like, should he have done this even? And this is kind of like the earlier question that we dealt with. This is the Sabbath school lesson without answers, maybe. But should he have done this? I think this is an interesting question, and since I've just thought about it aloud, I don't know, Carl, if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I do like how you kind of set that up, because it's interesting to think when Paul arrives, he actually arrives with a delegation of Gentiles, and Paul sees this. This has been kind of the goal of his ministry. He wanted to raise these missionary funds to help support the poor believers in Jerusalem, and we see this in 1 Corinthians 16. He's trying to raise this money. He mentions it elsewhere, and so he comes with this like parade of nations, and he sees himself as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy of the Gentiles who are coming now to Jerusalem, and they bring these gifts, and they do welcome them, but it's kind of discouraging when they're like, yeah, thanks, but, thanks for the money, great, but there's all these suspicions. And Paul, for all you talked about before in a previous lesson about his personality and hard and obstinate sometimes, he really tries to live out here all things to all people that he mentions in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 by trying just to go along with the flow. And he does it. And it does seem to me that his actions were not entirely in harmony with the principles that he had laid out. At least it became an element of confusing, because it's the Jewish believers who are concerned, and so in trying to help them save some face perhaps, that he consents to do this, but it doesn't turn out to be positive. In the end, it lands him in prison for more than 2 years. So to me, and I've read a little bit from comments that writers like Ellen G. White makes in her commentary in this passage, and she kind of indicates the same thing, that this was a weakness on Paul's part, that he should have stood firm rather than go into the temple and trying to be all things to all people in this case.
Yeah, and as you were talking, there was something I wanted to add, and now, right in this moment, I forget what it was, Carl.
It is interesting. I'll just, as you think about it, and what gets him in trouble is the fact that there are Jews there from Ephesus and other parts of the world, and from elsewhere, and they see one of these. They think they see one of these Gentiles from Ephesus in the temple. Turns out it's a mistake. There was a wrong identification, but there's this flash mob, and the Jews are intent on really taking Paul's life if it wasn't for the intervention of the Roman soldiers who would pace the walls around the temple to actually save his life in that moment. His life could have been ended.
Yeah, and the point that I wanted to make that I have now recalled is really a rather minor point. But it's simply this, that when you have a group of people who have kind of already made up their mind, maybe we should say, about you, they're suspicious of you, it is so incredibly difficult to get people to change their mind once they've made that determination. And you can sort of try to placate them or pacify them, but then the charge will be, well, you're just doing that to try to cover up. So I think we see that playing out here, that once people have determined who you are in their own minds, it is really it's really difficult to change people's minds. It was that point was all that I wanted to add.
No, a key point, I think, well said, and that's where I think Paul made his mistake and rather should have stayed firm to his principles. And again, this just shows that Paul himself is human. And sometimes we get this idea that, we see these pictures with Paul with a halo around his head, the saint who always does everything right. But I think it's important to remember that he's human, and we saw that with his argument with Barnabas and the challenges of that. And so it's not a surprise that Paul might go a step too far, but his motive was right, but it didn't actually accomplish the purpose that he had hoped. He ends up getting arrested. Roman soldiers intervene to save his life. How does Paul go about defending himself now in this new kind of territory he's arrested now?
Yeah, this struck me as I read the chapter again, because he's being accused by his own people, and his response, which is in chapter 22, he makes this response to them, and instead of trying to deal point by point with like the theological issues and quoting proof texting from the Hebrew scriptures, he responds to their accusations by sharing his own personal testimony. He tells a story, and the story that he tells, obviously it's his own personal story, and it's the second time that this story shows up in the book of Acts. This is the story of his meeting Jesus on the road to Damascus. And previously, when we read it, it's the narrated form that the author of Acts is telling the story. This is Paul in his own words sharing what happened to him. And it's a message of Jesus, appearing to him, calling his name, the Lord telling him that he would be shown what he must do, how there's a respected man, Ananias, a devout observer of the law, highly respected by all the Jews living there, who comes to him. And then the message that the Lord said that the message gave the message that the Lord gave to Paul, which was, "Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles." So Paul defends himself by sharing his own personal testimony and saying, essentially, I'm simply obeying the directive of Jesus himself. So this is a different way, I think, of defending himself. I think I would tend to go, or we might tend to go, the more sort of theological route, the more kind of academic route, we might say. And here we have Paul, who's he's an academic. He's well trained under Gamaliel, but when it comes right down to it, he defends himself by telling his experience of meeting Jesus. I think that's instructive and inspirational.
It is, I think, instructive and inspirational when you think of the context. I mean, I can just imagine him, probably his clothes are torn, maybe he's missing a shoe, he has a black eye, his hair's messed up. Because they were really roughing him up. And I can imagine many people saved from that kind of environment would, when they get the chance, might turn around and say, chew them out, right? Say some inappropriate terminology, tell them to get lost, God curse you. But he has this great burden to reach the Jewish nation. It just wears on his heart. He sees his own failures and mistakes and the transformation, how his life has changed, and he longs for that to be the experience of his fellow Jews. And what happens, right? What's the effect of his testimony?
Yeah, this is the leading question that you asked. When Paul says, reports the words of Jesus to him, "Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles." When the crowd hears that, the next verse says, verse 22, the crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, "Rid the earth of him, he's not fit to live." So it was when they heard that, according to Paul, the Lord had sent him to share the message of life, to share the gospel with the Gentiles. That was more than they could bear. They said, he is not fit to live. He's not fit to live.
So I guess we ask this question: what is it that leads someone to? I think I'm okay to say this word. I don't think it's too strong. To hate others of a different nationality, that they would really want the world to be rid of them. What process? How does that? And I guess I could understand that, Paul, if we were talking about people who didn't consider themselves religious. But the people who are doing this is an act of violence that takes place in what would be considered the most sacred, the most holy place in all Jerusalem, the place where the Jews believed God's presence dwelled. This is that place. And it's that place where they would feel justified in taking this man's life. How does that happen to religious people? And could that happen to us?
Yeah, I spent a little bit of time thinking about this, and I don't know that I don't think I have a good answer, but I actually think that the religious component, for a religious person to believe that it would be better for the earth to be rid of someone, I think it's actually the religiosity of that person plays into the answer. I think a person would believe that the message that is being shared, and this I think is what they believed of Paul, that the message that he is sharing is so dangerous both to us but also to the cause of God, that would be their rationale. They would see it as righteous indignation as almost a necessity in order to preserve like the truth about God, right? So they would understand in this declaration that they were speaking on behalf of God, that this is what God would want as well. So it seems to be that their association or their belief that they, as a Jewish nation, um, that God's favor so clearly rested on them, and that their law and their temple um, and their customs were so inextricably linked with God, that someone who would threaten that and somehow throw open the gates, so to speak, the access to God to other people, it's their religious convictions, in a sense, that would fuel their hatred or their fear. And maybe it's a combination of these things. What if this message actually gets out? Then, what is lost then? We lose. And I think they would also have believed that somehow, the message, the true message from God, would somehow have been sullied as well. So I feel like my comments on that were a little bit kind of jumbled there, but the religiosity may actually contribute to their antagonism, because they would legitimize it as righteous indignation, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a scary thing because, I mean, as Christians, right, self-acclaimed Christians, we're religious people, and just because we're religious people doesn't mean that we could be overcome by hatred towards someone. It's a tricky thing, but a warning, I think, to all of us. As our time begins to wind down, I guess I'm just interested to talk a second about what happens next, because it's interesting to notice the interaction. These Roman soldiers have no clue what's going on. I mean, they save this guy's life. They bring him up here. He wants to speak to these people. They're accommodating. And now, in Luke, in the account, he tells us that the guards just have no clue. Like, why? Who is this guy? And why is he causing such anger and hatred? And people are yelling and screaming at him. And so it says that they set out to flog Paul in order to get the truth out of him. And it looks like things have gone from bad to worse, yet Paul's able to get out of this. And there's a trump card, you might say, a trump card that he plays that saves the day, and that is what?
Yeah, his Roman citizenship. And I'm glad that you brought this up. This is a little like off script, but I'm very glad you brought this up, because to me, in a previous lesson, I talked about a little bit about Paul's personality, of course, through my eyes. But I think we see another kind of element of Paul's personality, and I don't know if I'll call it humor here, because like he's been beaten. I mean, this is rough. So it's not like a, ha ha kind of a joke here, but Paul's attitude, because there's the order um, that he be flogged and questioned, and it says, as they stretched him out to flog him, Paul says to the centurion standing there. So he lets them go through all this, kind of preparing for the flogging. This isn't an instant thing. And then he doesn't actually say that he's a Roman citizen, but he asks a question, almost kind of a by the way kind of a question. Paul said to the centurion, is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty? I mean, Paul knows the answer to this question, but he asked the question. And the centurion, when he heard this, went to the commander and reported it. What are you going to do? This man is a Roman citizen. And then the commander goes to Paul and asks him, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? And then Paul says, yeah, I am. Then the commander said, I had to pay a big price for my citizenship. And then Paul's response is, but I was born a citizen. So it's just this fascinating interchange where he takes his time letting them know, and then sort of drops the hammer there at the end. Actually, I am born as a Roman citizen. And then, of course, they don't know what to do because they should not have treated him in the way that they did. I find it to be, for all the kind of sadness in the story, this is kind of I feel guilty saying it, but it's kind of a light part to the story, I think. There's probably something that you wanted to add, Carl, maybe, so go for it.
It is interesting. It's like this. It does make you want to smile when you think about the circumstances, and it's also actually pretty shrewd in his part because, besides saving him being flogged, but it actually turns the tables entirely on these soldiers because, in their viewpoint, I mean, they're Roman soldiers, and so he's a lowly Jew. So there's a power structure here, a hierarchy, that Paul is low, and like a slave, they can beat a slave because you never trust a slave will tell you the truth. You always beat them first. And by pulling this trump card out, it turns out that he's higher up on the totem pole than they are because he's a Roman citizen. And not every Roman soldier was a citizen. And even when the tribune comes, Paul actually has more honor than he does because Paul was born a Roman citizen. So the tables are flipped on him, and then Paul here becomes their guest of honor rather than the person that's going to get flogged and beat and be mistreated. So it is just an interesting sidebar. People often wonder sometimes, like, did Paul have credentials? Well, there were credentials if you were a Roman citizen, but whether Paul had them tucked in his back pocket or they had to go to the archives, we're not sure how that played out, but it would have been able to be verified. And in this case, it saved Paul a real beating.
Yeah. So, Carl, the credentials, I've had students ask me about this before. So, like, is it a stone or what would it be? They didn't have like a social security card then, but what would it have been that he could have shown if he had it on him?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know for sure, but we do know that at that point in time, Roman documents were like a wooden tablet, and oftentimes they would have an inlay of wax in it, and then they would record, events. And so we found birth certificates, legal documents preserved that way. So there may have been something like that that could have been like his copy of it, that would have been readily accessible, perhaps in his knapsack back at the hotel, at the house he was staying in. But they would have been able to verify that because otherwise anybody could lie and say, hey, I'm a Roman citizen. But no, the evidence would be there, and he would have had some sort of proof that would have been able to confirm that. Our time is just about up, just a couple of minutes left. Anything else strike you about Paul's story? I mean, it's told 3 times. Here he tells it himself, and it's probably one of the most powerful accounts of that. Anything strike you then again about his experience on the Damascus Road?
There is, and I'll share this from the text, and then I'll tell a little story, and that for me will be kind of the wrap up to this discussion. In chapter 22, Paul tells the story. About noon, as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Our English translation here, they do a fine job. It is Saul, Saul, but there's something interesting with this name. And we talk quite a bit about Saul, becoming Paul, but there's 2 different Sauls in the book of Acts. When Saul is first introduced, when I say 2 different Sauls, I mean the word actually that is translated Saul appears in 2 forms in the book of Acts. When Saul is first introduced in Acts chapter 8 and Acts chapter 9, there at the death of Stephen, it's the Greek form of the Hebrew word. So Saulus is what it is in the Greek, literally, and that's the Greek form. When Jesus comes to Saul and calls his name, both in the first account that's given and then when Saul is recounting it here, It's not Saulus any longer. It's not that form of the name Saul. It's rather the transliteration of the Aramaic word. So it's Saul. Saul is the way it appears here in our verse. And this seems like a small thing maybe, but basically what it is, the way I read this, is that when Jesus appears to Saul, he speaks to him in his mother tongue, in his birth language, in the language of his heart. And I think this is significant. If you've been part of a culture where your name, the name that your parents gave you, people struggle with pronouncing it, or they say it in a different way. To hear someone say your name the way it was really meant to be said, that can touch your heart when someone goes to the efforts maybe to learn how to say your name appropriately, or just uses your name appropriately. And it's a small touch, like I said, and maybe it doesn't seem significant to other people. But for me, Jesus calling Saul, 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 I love that about Jesus. He connects with Saul in that very, very personal sort of way. And that brings me to my final little story here. I heard it, I don't remember how many years ago now. Has it been 3 years ago, 4 years ago? It's the story of a Jordanian man raised in Amman, Jordan, and a Muslim background, of course, but not a particularly religious background. And while he was in high school, the terms we would use is he began to be radicalized. He actually was somewhat affiliated with a terrorist group headed by al-Zarqawi, I think I'm saying that correctly. So he's radicalized, he's being radicalized, and he was in high school. And I heard him tell the story himself. He said he was seated studying for his schooling, his high school classes. And while he was sitting there, a man suddenly appeared to him. And he knew it was Jesus. How did he know it was Jesus? I don't know, but as a Muslim at that point, in Islam, Jesus is known in Islam. And the man that appeared to him, he knew that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. You are mine, and I want you to follow me. Saul had Jesus appear to him on the way to Damascus. This man had Jesus appear to him while he was studying for his exams in high school. And there's other beautiful parts to the story, but I went up to this man afterwards. I was moved to tears as I heard him tell his story. And I went up to him afterwards with a strange question. I asked him, what language did Jesus speak when he said that to you? When he said, you are mine and I want you to follow me, what language did Jesus say? And I'm not sure, I think he was kind of wondering where I was going with that, but he said, well, he spoke Arabic. He spoke Arabic to me. And I said, did Jesus have an accent at all? And I think at that point, he kind of knew where I was going, and he laughed. And he said, no, Jesus spoke perfect Arabic. Perfect Arabic. Whoever we are, whether we're from Amman or Tarsus or Jerusalem or Somalia or wherever it might be, I think it's still true that when Jesus comes to us, he knows our name and he can speak our language perfectly. And I love that about our Jesus.
Amen. Thank you, Paul. Thank you again for joining us for Theology Sabbath School. Powerful message, way to end, and for you, our viewers, for joining us. And a special thanks to Parker LeClaire and our cameraman today, and also Alex Paxa, our program manager who puts all the pieces together. We wish you a wonderful week. Take care. God bless. We'll see you next week. We'll be studying Acts chapter 23 and chapter 24. Take care. God bless. And bye-bye.